This hour. A number of listeners reached out to me to say, Richie, you've got to interview and speak with Professor Lucian Gill because he's made a very interesting film, Richie. He's also he's published a very interesting book about climate change. Now, Lucian Gill is an incredibly qualified man. Amongst his many achievements, he's worked in Washington in nuclear cleanup. He's worked for the Chinese government. Would you believe it? He completed his education in chemistry, physics and nuclear technologies and science in his 20s. He got his doctorate. He's worked in water, soil and science, dealing with pollution in the oil and chemical industries. He has been a visiting professor in England and Malaysia. Look, I could be giving you his resume all day long. Why is he interesting? Well, the very beginning, when he heard about man-made climate change, he watched with interest how panic spread through the media, through the news and through governments, that global temperature rises would be catastrophic for humanity. He was sceptical and he began to look at this for himself, at global warming caused by CO2. And he noticed that there was a relationship between temperatures at ground and air level and the water concentration and the soil, the water content of the soil. He says he's watched the gradual transfer of water from the land to the oceans. He says the dry areas are ever increasing and the temperatures are going up because of this. And industrial agriculture is not only stripping water from land, it is leading to a rise in CO2. I'm delighted to welcome to the programme none other than Professor Lucian Gill. Lucian, welcome to the show. It's lovely to have you on. How are you?
Oh, that's fine, thanks. I think that finishes it and we can all go home now.
I know sometimes when I have academics like yourself who have done quite a bit, I sometimes feel like that. I think the introduction is going to go on longer than the actual conversation, but it's nice. It must be nice for you to know that people who've read your book and watched your film have been reaching out to the show in great numbers to say, Richie, give this gentleman a hearing. Because I understand, Lucian, that you've been on local and commercial radio recently to talk about your findings. And from what I understand, they couldn't wait to get you off quick enough. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yes, it comes a bit of a surprise because I'm 77, so in my 20s I believed very much in science and the educational system. It wasn't privatised then, it was much more idealistic. And all the scientists and the professors were working their best for humanity, if you want to put it that way. And people were always interested in arguing and going on TV or wherever and speaking. But I was invited to speak on a show, and they started off and they said, now, most scientists will say that global warming, it's fixed. We know all about it. You disagree with that. So would you sit and tell us why? And I started talking, and within a few minutes, there was a noise in the corridor as people ran down. The door opened. I said, that's it. Shut down or you'll lose your license.
Get him off the air at the speed of light. Isn't that tragic, though? So they were nice enough to say, OK, Professor Gill, you dissent from the scientific consensus, and you're going to tell me in a moment, and I think you might be right, that the scientific consensus is not actually legitimate because they don't agree as much as we're told to believe it. So they invite you on to say, tell us why, and within minutes, station managers are saying, get him off the air. That's the kind of thing that goes on in communist China or North Korea, Lucian.
You'd be amazed. I think it goes on here even worse. You just don't see it because you don't expect it. But it was as quick as that. They are monitored all the time, everything that people are saying, and you step out of the line and that's it. And it works the other way as well. The scientists and the academics who claim to be this 100% are basically those who are getting the grant money to do the research. And of course, the research has to agree with what the government wants. So the people who disagree, they don't get the money. And if you're in academia and your bread and butter depends on agreement, then you agree.
You'll agree. Now, I want to use this time as wisely as we can. And can I just say this from the outset? Not because I like what you're saying or because, I've read a lot about this myself and because I have a lot of sympathy with your arguments, even though I'm not a scientist. So I'm not saying this for that reason. Look, it's obvious that I'm very interested in what you have to say, but we might end up going into a part 2 on this. So if at some stage around about 5:45, we shouldn't panic. If you think I've lots more to say, we can always pick it up again next week or whenever it's convenient for you, because there is a lot to get through. So I want to start. I want you to treat me like I'm an idiot, like not like I'm an idiot, but like I'm 7 years old, right? And I think one of the things that you do in your video, it's brilliant. You do make it understandable for people. Folks, I reckon you should go to YouTube after the programme. I'll put a link on. Catchments and Carbon is a video that went up a couple of months ago. The channel is Water21, Catchments and Carbon. And you'll see Lucian there using his pen name, which is very clever, Lois Caborn. We'll talk about that later on as well. And he explains his theory. So tell us then, Lucian, your theory. Tell us about the soil, how you believe the soil is losing moisture and water, why this is happening, and how this is leading to some warming. Talk to us from the very outset, then, the beginning.
Okay, well, I worked in India for quite a long time. I was a government scientist for what's called the Indo-British Partnership. So I was regularly in there looking at water and pollution and soil and things and giving advice. And what I did was, in the 50th anniversary of Indian independence, there was a special conference. So because I've been dealing with water, I thought, well, let's have a look at the state of the world in terms of water. And what I put up was that at that point, 17 countries in the Middle East, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, as well as South Africa, Pakistan, and so on, will face absolute water scarcity by 2025. And 24 other countries in sub-Saharan Africa will face economic water scarcity, which means they've run out of water completely. And that globally, 70% of water taken from the rivers or aquifers is used to irrigate and then dumped in the ocean. Now, that was Delhi, 1997. And it has not got any better since. So I have that in my mind when people were talking about CO2 being responsible for the increase in temperatures and the increase in warming and how big a disaster it would be. And I began to feel a bit uneasy about that because I'd worked in infrared myself. I did a research doctorate. And so what they were saying about infrared didn't fit in with my experience in that time. So I thought there was something fishy. And I carried on looking at that. And I worked a lot in Sudan. In the south, it's quite tropical. In the north, you have the desert. So you can't help but notice that something causes a difference. And the difference is water content. So I began really to look more and more at the function of water. And of course, if you are driving around in your car and you have a stone punctures your radiator and the water begins to drop out, then your car starts to overheat, behave erratically, and if you keep going, it will come to a grinding halt and overheat. And so the reason for that is quite simple. Water is the heat transfer fluid for the radiator, for the car, but it's also the heat transfer fluid for the planet. And if you're in a desert and there is no water, when the temperature goes up in the morning, it goes up rapidly and it stays high, but then it drops to almost freezing at night. If you're in a place further south where there is water held in a green soil, the temperature is moderated. And in England, of course, the temperature is well moderated. So I began to look skeptically at what was being said. And the first thing I noticed was that we have a lot of impact on fossil fuels. we are told fossil fuels is the guilty party. And they produced a graph, which is a fairly famous graph, the hockey stick graph, I think, which showed industrial revolution and CO2 going up. And they put an arrow where the industrial revolution occurred around about 1750, and it began to rocket upwards from then onwards. And they said, here you are, this proves that the emissions from the industrial revolution, the CO2, have caused the temperatures to go up. Unfortunately, that's a correlation. And they admitted that. And people may not realise that a correlation is not proof. It just happens to correlate. And the reason you use a correlation is that you have to investigate to find out why there is a correlation. So I looked at that and was told that we were generating something like 10 billion tons per annum of CO2 from fossil fuels, from the cars, the diesel engines, power stations using oil and so on, and coal. And therefore, we had to stop this, otherwise, as the graph showed, it would rocket skywards and overheat. So I started to make troubles quite simply by asking, okay, 10 billion tons for fossil fuels, 7 billion tons for forest fires, more fires, 8 billion tons, forest fires, 10 billion tons, cattle, 9 billion, remove woodland, 10 billion tons. You get the idea of where I'm going, yeah?
Yeah.
So overall, you're looking at only about 12 or 13% of the deadly CO2 emission being caused by fossil fuel, and nobody's saying anything about all the rest of it, which is about 88, nearly 90%. So I thought that was a bit strange in itself. And then I thought, well, why on earth should agriculture be producing so much carbon dioxide? What's the mechanism? And when I looked at that, I found that the famous graph that they had put up actually came from agriculture. It was nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution. It was the graph of the spread of agriculture throughout the world, right down into Africa, to India, to Asia, and so on. And the graph of temperature rise and CO2 emission correlates far better with that one than it does with hydrocarbons from industrial emissions.
Now, Lucian, did you mean the introduction of industrialised heavy machinery agriculture, or just agriculture generally? Because agriculture of one form or another has been around since Moses was in short trousers. So which is it?
Agriculture in general, but it began to accelerate once you brought the machinery and the fertilizer in. Because at the time, people were trying desperately to feed the world, which is very good.
Yeah.
But that really caused a big jump. And so they're looking at something that says there is a link between agriculture and there's a link between even more emissions of CO2 from agriculture and the temperature rise than there is with hydrocarbons. So again, something going on.
Now, farmers listening to this might be hopping mad, but we might need to tell them, calm down a bit now. You've got to listen to the rest of this, right? Because you're not blaming farmers for global warming, because this is important. And we spoke off air today about the protests in France and Germany and everywhere else. This is absolutely fascinating. Professor Lucian Gill is live on the programme. Now we're getting to the crux of his theory. Fascinating what you said there about this hockey graph and how you believe, and how many people like you believe, that the rise was a correlation, not a cause, in industrial activity, and the rise in CO2 output was a correlation, and that you began to look at agriculture, and that's where you felt the CO2 was coming from. Just want to reiterate this for our listeners. And it was agriculture in general, not yet the industrialised agriculture, which we will be talking about in a moment. So just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, with agriculture in general, soil breathes. that may come as a shock to some people, but in the same way that humans breathe, taking oxygen, give out CO2 and so on, agriculture breathes, the soil breathes. And the reason for that is that the bacteria in the soil breathe. Some of them need oxygen, some of them don't need oxygen, some of them trap carbon from the air, CO2, and turn it into organic carbon in the soil. In fact, our soil has been created by the organisms, the algae, the bacteria, and so on. And the soil has been created over millions of years from the soil processes which breathes. And you can measure what they call soil respiration quite easily. It's a common practice. So what had happened that had accelerated the CO2 emissions? And why? Because CO2 is turning everything back to carbon. So when I began to look at that, I found that when you sprayed, in order to do modern agriculture, you have to get rid of the weeds for a start. So you spray with pesticides, herbicides, all the rest of it. And what was happening was that you spray with your pesticides, your herbicides, and it's wonderful. It kills the weeds, and everything is nicely grows all at the same time and so on. Unfortunately, it kills all the bacteria. Now, one of the bacteria that it kills, I worked using the soil bacteria to clean up pollution. So I was into the bacterial side of things. One of the group generates a glue, a polysaccharide glue, which is very good, and it glues the top of the soil. You can't actually see this without your microscope. It glues the top of the soil together so that when it rains, the soil is not destroyed by the impact of rain. It stays where it is, allows the water to go through, and your plants can get the water and carry on growing happily. And down in the soil, the bacteria are bringing nitrogen in from the air and CO2 and so on, and there's oxygen coming out. When you destroy the polysaccharide glues, when it rains, the soil breaks down. And it breaks into finer and finer particles, and if you get a flood, it washes the soil down to the river. And we, in this country at the moment, are losing 60 tonnes per hectare per annum of soil from agricultural areas. And it's going into the river. It fills the river basin up, so the river cannot carry water anymore as much as it could. So you're generating floods, but you're not dredging. But essentially, you're destroying the bacterial life of the soil with the new pesticides and herbicides. And if you're using wormers, for example, for cattle, those wormers go straight through into the soil, and they kill all the other organisms in soil. Let's call them the worms. Okay, and it goes into the water course, and it kills the aquatic life. So our aquatic life is being hit by bacterial destruction, the worms being destroyed, the aquatic life being destroyed from a build-up of the herbicides and pesticides and worming agents. Yeah?
Now, Lucian, you must not be the only person who knows this. By the way, this is news to me, right? Because I've interviewed men and women over the years who talked about the lack of dredging. European Union directives, and we must protect some exotic fly that lives near the riverbed or near the riverbank. We don't dredge, we get flooding. I knew none of this until I began researching you. So a naturally occurring glue that holds soil together is destroyed by industrialised farming. If it wasn't, if the naturally occurring glue is there, the rain passes through the soil is undamaged, and the soil produces crops. But with the herbicides, the glue is destroyed, the soil washes away. 60 tonnes per annum, per hectare, is washed away into river basins and into, reservoirs maybe, but rivers. That leads to a build-up, you said, meaning that rivers eventually break their banks. The news media goes into overdrive, Lucian. It talks in apocalyptic language, and it tells us this is down to man-made climate change. That's what they say.
Absolutely. That's brilliant, yeah. I'll get you to write my next book, I think.
But
no, that is what's happening.
And is it widely known, Lucian? Would the proponents of climate change, would they have this information?
I don't think they look for it, to be honest, because I'm being quite old. I've been involved in research and all the rest of it, and I've seen a situation like the climate change scenario before, to do with water treatment systems. Very good systems that can clean water and sewage and all sorts of things, but they're fairly cheap, and they can be built by farmers, and they can be built by communities with some help from specialist designers, yeah? Now, they came in many years ago, and suddenly you had a mass of the academia funded by industry group who formed very quickly an alternate to these systems that was a counterfeit. It couldn't clean pesticides, couldn't clean herbicides. They did very little, but they were lovely and green, so it was greenwash. What happened was that every academic area was saturated by government, EU and so on, with grants, but of course you could only write in favour of the fake technology.
Right.
And the real technology was taken away and buried. And the same has happened with climate change. You only get to do what you're told to do. So it's the same process. Governments control information through academia, and they control academia by giving them the grants. So, yeah, it doesn't really get out there.
So it doesn't get out there. Can I interject? I interviewed Professor Ian Plimer a couple of times over the years. And some of what Ian believes may very well go along with, correlate with your theories. Maybe some of it differs. But he often talks about how CO2 is sequestered and how the planet has always done it naturally and how the planet has degassed itself. So what you're saying is then that through the pesticide usage right across the world, it'll be in every country, the bacteria that held on to the carbon is gone. So now the CO2 is being released out of the soil, which is being washed away and rendered useless. And is it that CO2 then that they're measuring and telling us, oh, there's been a huge increase in CO2? Have I gotten that wrong, or is that the right takeaway?
In part, no. What they're seeing is that once the soil collapses, every farmer knows you get a bit of peat and you put it into your sand and you put it in your pot, and your pot will hold water, yeah? And your plants will grow. And you don't have to water it so often. But it's a bacterial process. The whole thing about plants, the plant roots are covered with bacteria that are giving it the food, they're changing everything, they're bringing in CO2 in and so on. Once you start to get rid of that, the oxygen comes, the bacteria for the plants are killed as well. It doesn't need it anymore because you're giving it lots of fertilizer. It doesn't have to do the nitrate, we'll call nitrate cycle. You're breastfeeding it, so it doesn't need to stand on its own feet. The carbon material, the peat, starts to oxidize. So the carbon material in the soil is oxidized. That's where the net 8 billion is coming from.
Right.
And at the end of that process, your plants are standing in sand because all the carbon has gone. Now, at that point, it will keep going because you give it all the pesticides, the herbicides, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, yeah? So you're growing a plant totally artificially. The soil is just there to hold it upright. Unfortunately, you only get now about 2 days water supply in the soil, so you can get water shortages, yeah? Because it's all out of balance. When you used to have an organic soil with peat in there, you maybe need water for maybe 10, 12 days. So the whole cycle of the soil has been destroyed. There is a bigger impact, which I can just move on to now, in that if you look at the energy coming down from sunshine, then in a green field, green crops, properly organic, then you may get about 50% of that sunlight going to the plant to drive photosynthesis. And 50% is keeping the soil warm. Okay?
Yeah.
As you destroy the plant, the bacteria in the plant, and as you release the water and turn to sand, the water drains away, and the soil is not, which used the water to absorb the heat and evaporate to give you rain, is not doing that anymore. So you have no heat transfer mechanism left in your soil. And so the farmers had, in the 50s and 60s, equations called the Penman equations, and they could calculate from the amount of sunshine, the amount of moisture and rain, how much extra water they might need for a crop. And what those equations show is that as your soil carbon goes down, as your water content in your soil goes down, the soil temperatures go up because the water is not taking the heat from the soil and carrying it up into the clouds. So the correlation that says agriculture is losing carbon by oxidation is then causing the global warming because the water is draining from the soil. So your heat transfer mechanism has gone, your radiator has been punctured, and you're into a very bad scenario. I looked at, a short time ago, in Europe, and Europe is on the verge of catastrophe. The groundwater reserves have dried up, and there is major drought, the worst in 500 years, right across Europe. The reason being, they're losing their soil moisture, and oh, by the way, they've lost all their soil carbon. Why have they lost all the soil carbon? Because it's being destroyed by spraying
pesticides right across the continent by biotech companies like Monsanto and others. This is some theory. So you do get some warming as a result of this, and they jump on that warming and say that it's down to human activity. When you believe it isn't, it's down to the destruction. And you know, I'm genuinely getting shivers down my spine now, because I interviewed a Monsanto apologist a few years ago. And I didn't know any of this stuff, right? But I did my homework. And Monsanto was marketing a seed that would work in soil with where the soil was suffering from abiotic stress. And what you're describing is abiotic stress. And I didn't know too much at the time, but I did know enough because I'd interviewed Vandana Shiva and others. And I said to the Monsanto apologist, but I said, isn't it entirely plausible that you're actually responsible for the abiotic stress in the soil that you're now producing a seed for because of your pesticides and stuff? So it kind of comes full circle. And now I'm speaking to Professor Lucian Gill. And you said to me earlier, back in 1997, you became aware of this, that in some Middle Eastern countries, Lucian, you recognised that 70% of the groundwater, of the water, was not remaining in the soil. It was going back to the sea.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was catastrophic for drought. That was causing drought.
Yeah. Now, just to make that even more scary.
Well, it's scary enough now, to be honest. But go on.
Yeah. That's why. That's why I love scientists to come and argue, but I don't want to be shut down because we literally are talking about our future. So, in the European drought, the worst in 500 years, with the lowest soil carbon now, because they're using the pesticides, herbicides all over Europe, 20 billion tons of water are discharged every year from Europe into the sea. So over 50 years, this equates to 1,000 billion tons. And this accounts for 90% of the sea level rise. And the water cycle on land is now totally disrupted. So when it rains, the soil can't hold the water. It goes straight to the river, which is full of the soil residues. It floods everywhere. You build more houses and you close off the aquifer so the soil can't get to the aquifer. And all of that's happening, every time you open up some new agricultural land, you're carrying out the same process, closing the aquifer, destroying the soil. And the temperatures are going up. They're not going up because of petrol and diesel. That is totally irrelevant. You could burn as much as you wanted, and it would make absolutely no difference. What is doing the damage is the industrialized agricultural soil system.
Now, your credentials are genuine and real because I looked them up, right? So everything you claimed to do, you have done. I mean, you've done it all, really. But I've still got to ask you. It sounds like you've got a lot of sympathy for the old, mining, the old coal and oil. So I've got to ask you, is what you're telling me the result of your genuine bona fide academic interest as a researcher, or do you have any connections at all to the fossil fuel industries? Because I know you'll be accused of it.
No, good question. And no, by all means ask. I'm totally transparent. When I left school, 15 years old, 62 years ago, whatever, I went to what was called the gas industry, the gas works. And so I spent 7 years, wonderful years, on the huge gas works, learning my chemistry, engineering, using coal to generate the old town gas, if you remember that.
Yeah.
Now, my brother was actually down the mine sending me the coal when I was doing the analysis and helping to run the gas works, yeah? I have a lot of sympathy for coal. You get dirty exhaust from coal, but that can be cleaned up and you can use coal. So I do have a lot of sympathy. I also did some research on the North Sea oil fields, and I have worked for Shell, BP, Petronas Malaysia, China National Oil. What I was doing for them was cleaning up the pollution from the oil fields using soil and soil bacteria to destroy the pollution. The biggest project of that size that I did was in what is now North Sudan, where I was working to do natural systems using bacteria, plants and soil from the local areas, and we were cleaning up. We had a total potential of 500,000 tons per day of clean water from the dirty oil in the oil industry.
Jesus.
So yes, I've got, connections, but no.
And tell me this, Lucian, if we accept, and I do really, I don't believe that anthropogenic warming theory holds any water, no pun intended. I just don't believe it. And it's not because I want to. Like, I'm an old lefty. You won't know anything about me, but I'm an old trade unionist. And we were sold climate change before anybody else. So I would have banged the drum for climate change being real in the 90s. I would have believed it. I don't believe it now. And like yourself, it's not because I'm being paid. Like yourself, it's because what I really believe. But can I ask you a very quick 30-second question before I read you some comments? I told you our listeners would be reaching out to us in great numbers. They are. Loads of interesting comments. So I agree with you. And a lot of our listeners will. But oil and gas, oil and coal particularly, they're dirty, aren't they? I mean, surely we should be advanced enough now to be moving away from fossil fuels in any case. What would you say to that?
Well, if you can find me a fuel that gives as much energy as oil and gas, then fine, as a commercial competitor. But you can't, because if you look at wind turbines, energy is a complete separate section, but you will never ever achieve using wind turbines anything like the energy density that you need. That is just cloud cuckoo land. And the reason that we're getting so much of it is because the people are being taxed. It's now a subsidy, of course. Here, have 20 billion to the Germans to build turbines for us. Get the Chinese to build your solar panels. They themselves will not produce the energy we need. Nuclear we could do, but that gives off a dirty spent fuel. So we should research it, but we should research it properly in competitive areas, not by just having politicians
decide.
Say,
fair enough. Now we've got 8 minutes today. I told you we'll end up doing a part 2 with your permission. Listen, I am going to promote the. I know you spent some time in Cork. I know you've got ancestry there, so you'll understand the term. I'm going to promote the bejesus out of your book and and out of the YouTube channel as well.
Right.
No, I will do. Water 21. That's without a gap. Water 21 is YouTube channel. Catchments and Carbon. It's a 6-minute film. Go and look at it. There is a book called Catchments and Carbon, written by Lucian, but using the pen name Lois Caborn. You'll be proud of me as a fellow Paddy, Lucian. I got it straight away. I got the whole joke, the in-joke. Of course, it's soil carbon, isn't it? Lois Caborn. Yeah. It's brilliant. I was proud of myself. I normally don't get stuff like that. Lois Caborn is soil carbon. The book is Catchments and Carbon. Lois Caborn. I will put links on the podcast notes, and I urge our listeners to buy a copy of the book, to watch the film. I know that I'll be inviting Lucian back, but before, we've got 7.5 minutes now. Isabel says, Richie, fascinating to hear Lucian. Could you ask him for his take on how companies like Coca-Cola and industries like aluminium production have a responsibility for the disappearance of water in the soil? Major corporations have been taking water, haven't they, for years and years. Is this relevant to what you've been sharing with us today, Lucian?
Once you take the water out, your soil, not only your soil is dead, but it's what I was saying with the car. If you get a puncture of your car radiator, it will still go for a while, but you won't get very far before the whole thing breaks down. And that is what's happening. Now, if you remember the figures that I did for in India, I mean, that was, by 2025, absolute water scarcity, and that's what's happening. And 70% is wasted. It's just thrown away dirty into the sea. And we are dewatering the land. We should be managing all the catchments. That was the thing about the book. So yes, they have a big responsibility for it, and it's basically profit-driven industry that doesn't really care about the people anymore.
It certainly does not. Colin makes a good point, and this goes to what Professor Ian Plimer would have said on the programme, and I was going to ask you this anyway. If ice cores show us that there were periods on Earth when the CO2 levels were far, far higher than they are now, yet there was no agriculture back then, and Plimer reckons we're in an interglaciation period, that we're in between ice ages. Does that complement your work, do you think? I think in Colin's opinion anyway, he thinks it might be some sort of contradiction, the fact that we had massive CO2 in the atmosphere before agriculture. What do you say to that?
No, the world works on cycles. I mean, don't forget, at one time you would have hot rock, and that was it.
Yeah.
Now, then you got some algae, and then you got some fungi, and then they joined together and got on land and started dragging oxygen out of the air, and and the fungi started dissolving the soil, and that gave us a mineral soil, and the algae brought in CO2. No, the Earth is a process that, without interference, will go through various epochs and periods. It's only when man gets involved that we disrupt that, because we don't understand what we're doing.
Yeah. Lucian?
So I haven't found any of these things that actually go against what I've said. Yeah, when I've looked at it, it fits into the jigsaw.
It fits into the overall jigsaw puzzle. Seamus says this, Richie, what Lucian talks about with the soil literally turning to dust seems consistent with the farming in America during the Depression of the 1930s. The farmers of that era were heavily blamed for that catastrophe. Does Lucian know if the farmers in the 30s were using pesticides stroke herbicides? That's interesting.
No, not as much, but you can do it by mass dosing of phosphorus and potassium and overdoing it with fertilizers. Don't forget, if you have a plant that's growing and it's in soil, it has to work very hard to take the nutrients out of the soil. If you start giving it all your additives, bone and phosphorus and all, it will say, oh, thank you very much, and it will stop working, and it will just take that, and they will grow very big, but they stop working, and the soil gets destroyed. So
they might have overdone the fertilizers in the 30s, maybe.
Oh yes, their property, and on top of that, if you're growing cornflakes, then every packet of cornflakes is made from carbon, which is in the soil. If you're not putting that carbon back into the soil, you'll turn to sand. So you've actually got to put your cattle on rotation with your cornflake production or whatever. So you have to do a sort of organic rotation as they used to do. But they stopped doing it to mass produce just one thing.
Just one crop. That's right. I've read this many times in history books over the years, how they rotated crops to preserve that which you've just explained. Ardell says, we've literally got 2 minutes left. I'd love to invite you back when you have time. It could be a couple of weeks' time, whenever you have time, because we can talk a little bit more about this, but then we could talk about the implications for humanity, because they want to use this claim that fossil fuel burning and human activity is destroying the planet. You know, Lucian, they're using this claim to drastically transform life on planet Earth, and they're making things far more dystopian and controlling. So, I mean, these are things we could get into. Ardell says, Lucian makes a lot of sense. To me, modern compost is peat-free, but it is absolutely useless. As a grower, I've seen how these don't hold water anymore. It just passes straight through. That's from Ardell. Yeah,
absolutely. So, yeah, we're going to hell in a handcart, as they say. So, but what annoys me is I used to work at British Steel, cleaning up some of their pollution. If somebody down in Newport, they'll know the big microbiological system that British Steel built. I designed it for them to treat all their dirty water. And it breaks my heart to see the excuse of green energy to build an electric arc furnace, scrap the blast furnaces, and scrap 3,000 people.
3,000 people who've got nothing to do now.
It's absolutely disgraceful.
Listen, we're bang out of time, so let me do this, right? You have been listening to Professor Lucian Gill. There is a YouTube channel. Its name is Water21. Look for catchments and carbon. Don't panic, because when the podcast is live in about 25 minutes' time, I will put a direct link to the YouTube video. I will also put a link to Lucian's website where you can buy the book, right? He's used the pen name Lois Caborn. And I do urge and I do recommend strongly that you do get the book. It's been a pleasure to meet you. I'm so glad that my listeners, and I don't say this to patronise anybody, they're far more cutting edge than I am. They know what's going on. They know who to talk to. And they reached out and they said, Richie, get Lucian on. So pleasure, Lucian. I'll be in touch with you overnight. First of all, to thank you for coming on, and second of all, to arrange a follow-up with you, because, listen, no exaggeration, let me just look at the app. I've got 25, 26 questions there and comments, and they're all good comments and questions that we could possibly get into. But thanks for your time. I'll give you the final word, but we've only got 30 seconds, so quick final word to you. And again, I appreciate you and your time.
Thanks very much. And I don't know, yeah. That's very good of you. I'd be happy to come back and have more talks about it. It's got to be done because it is extremely serious.
Lucian, thanks so much for your time today. God bless, and we'll do it next time. Bye for now. Professor Lucian Gill there, live on Wednesday's Richie Allan show. Has worked in the industry. He acknowledged that in cleanup. Has degrees in chemistry.